Remember how the year 2018 started for you? I mean, for me, it was a really bad start in the year. And that was not because of a hangover or something, or, well, that's out of context of that speech. However, on January the 2nd, some really serious vulnerabilities became public. Most of you will, as security students or researchers, will have heard of them. They're known as Meltdown and Signal and Spectre. Signal is the very recent one. Anyway, I prepared a little timeline. So in beginning of January, Meltdown and Spectre became public. A month later, there were already the first reports of malware trying to exploit it, although still experimental, not really occurring in practice, but some malware authors already tried it. So, and the rest of 2018, yeah, a bunch of other attacks came out, just based on two main techniques used in modern CPUs, hyperthreading and speculative execution. So when preparing this talk, two other vulnerabilities were occurred. The one is port smash, also based on hyperthreading, and 2 days before, on Tuesday, the guys from TU Graz around Daniel Gruß found 7 new vulnerabilities, 7 new Spectre vulnerabilities. So what is the impact of these vulnerabilities? Well, they allowed a local attacker to extract arbitrary data from memory. Well, that's a very bad thing, but things get even worse if they're exploitable remotely. So, for example, via JavaScript from a browser environment. There are proof of concept exploits for this, so this really works. And things get even worse because there are proof of concept implementations that allow extraction of arbitrary data via the network. So, oh my goodness, we can read arbitrary memory via the network. This is crazy. So, who can feel safe? Well, technically, no one using modern computers. With the CPU built after 1959. So I went to the basement in the 2nd of January, and found this old Intel CPU. It's completely Spectre and Meltdown free, but it's 1989, 25 megahertz, so not really usable for our purposes. So potential affected computers use any architecture, any operating system on any device type. So the only thing we can do is not to trust the memory, because once something is loaded to memory, it can be extracted by a side channel. As long as a computer is turned on, operational and running, my personal idea is that there will be a way to craft a side channel to draw back conclusions about data that is being processed. So, how can we fix CPU vulnerabilities? There is a bunch of hardware deployed that is vulnerable that will not be fixed so quick. So, what can we do? Can we fix this just by software? Can we fix hardware vulnerabilities just by software? Think about the Hubble telescope. When they sent up the Hubble telescope in the mid-90s, you know, few hundred million of dollars, and it's not really working. Why? Because they built in the wrong mirror. So hundreds of millions of euros or dollars wasted. Well, not really, because what did NASA do? They implemented some software. The error is fixed. The delta of the error is fixed, so it's correctable by software. And this is the very same thing that's true for CPU vulnerabilities. Software can fix it, can fix them. Luckily, the attacks have some limitations, so stay calm. First of all, they're very difficult to do. Normally, in a normal company network, it's easier to find, a PHP vulnerability or an SQL injection or whatever. So this is probably not the first thing attackers will try. Via the network, data extraction only works under laboratory conditions, and we can extract just about 15 bits per hour. However, this is still frightening, because in 17 hours we could extract a 256-bit key from memory. Still, even if the timing stuff is very different and very divergent, it may still work. It is something we really need to consider. And luckily, there are mitigations on the way. Partly, they are already deployed via microcode updates, and most operating systems also include operating fixes for them at the operating system level. So don't trust the memory, and install, as usual, your software updates. Yeah, this is an overview about the vulnerabilities that were published just in 2018. There are, for some, fixes available. Some are so complicated that there are no real fixes available, but that we have not seen any real-world attacks. So, and some of these fixes have really serious performance impact. For example, Google knew about Spectre version 2 by mid-2017. Why? Because their Project Zero discovered these vulnerabilities independently. So they already developed a compiler fix and deployed it in the whole Google Cloud. And it ran stably, it works perfectly for Google. What did Microsoft do after these vulnerabilities became public? They tried to implement it for Windows, for Visual C++, and 30%, the result was 30% of computational power loss and unstable systems. So this is not really a general solution, because it's not working for all implemented systems. So we really need to, basically just to wait and not to trust the memory. And when preparing these presentations, 2 days before now, 7 new vulnerabilities occur. So this is a fact that speaks for itself. We can't really trust the memory. We can just wait and discover what more will come and apply our software updates. So, next part. How do they work? I'm not going to go into all the details, but I'm going to give a high-level overview so that you should be able to understand the basics of why CPU vulnerabilities work. First, some basic terms. What is a side channel attack? Yeah, a side channel attack is just an attack where an attacker is passive. So, for example, an attacker is listening to the CPU or listening to the effects the power consumption of the CPU does, or the attackers observe the timing behavior of a CPU, or really even listen to it. There are examples of exploits where you can really listen to a CPU and extract the key from 1 or 2 meters. So this is basically a side channel attack. And the very bad thing is, from side channel attacks, you can usually craft a covered channel attack. What is a covered channel? Something very similar to side channels, but on purpose. So the classical example is a Trojan horse or something. When you found a way to observe the data, you can craft a way to get the system into a state such that you can actively extract data. So as I promised, how does it work? Most people of you will know what this is and how this works. The CPU is connected to main memory via a bus, and data and commands are transferred. Usually CPUs cache memory that is used frequently. So, for example, real-world example is salt, like you have in your kitchen and you use for cooking. When you add salt to the meal you're cooking, you never run to the supermarket each time you add salt to your meal. You just use the salt you have in your kitchen. So you cache the salt. And this is the very same thing that CPUs do. They cache data that is used frequently. And modern CPUs use a technique called hyperthreading. What is hyperthreading? Imagine a CPU with just one single core. When one process is executing, all the instructions go to the CPU. So this is not something really special. But all the instructions that are used by the CPU, from that process do not occupy all parts of the CPU. So what do modern CPUs do? They appear virtually as a second CPU to the operating system. They do symmetric hyperthreading and allow another process to run at the very same time on the same core. So in reality, two processes are executed on one core. Why is this possible? Because the CPU reorders the instructions in a way such that they can run in parallel. And obviously, any instructions and data are cached by the CPU. And this is the very thing that CPU vulnerabilities do. When one process is malicious and is able to get the other process into a state such that it accesses interesting data, some critical data, they can spy on it by observing the caching behavior. I'm going to explain this more in detail, but first let's discuss speculative execution. So what is speculative execution? Again, we have on a single core CPU, we have one running process. Notice the difference to the hyperthreading example before is that this process is shorter. So there are empty instructions which would keep the CPU idle. This could be because the CPU is waiting for code that has to be loaded from secondary storage or from the network or whatever. So, and again, we have a second process that is running. And of course, everything the CPU processes is stored in the CPU caches. So what does the CPU do? It thinks, yeah, I don't want to be redundant, so I guess what process one, which would keep the CPU idle otherwise, does. So, and what happens if process 2 is malicious and tries to train the CPU and get it into a state such that process 1 executes some critical data. For example, some key, some crypto keys, or whatever critical data is. So the process 2 teases or tickles the CPU in a way that process 1 executes some loading instructions to load critical data to the CPU, and obviously this data gets stored into the CPU caches. And consequently, we can spy. The attackers can spy on them, on that data. Okay, take some sip of Club Mate or something, or whatever you have in front of you, because we are walking through Meltdown right now. So, step by step. What is the very first step? We have the CPU brought into a condition that the data is in the cache. That's the presumption. So step 1 is, what does a malicious process do? It accesses a data D at an illegal memory address. Why does the CPU execute that code and of an illegal memory instruction, of an illegal memory access? Well, because it executes the code speculatively. All the memory accesses before were nice and legitimate and everything. So the CPU expects that the next instructions will be fine as well. So it just executes it. Consequently, D gets loaded into the cache because there are no checks. So then this is the most important point. From that data D, the illegal data, we craft an address. We just take some bits. I can show it to you in assembly afterwards, but for now, it's just some bits of data, and we craft a memory address from it. This is done by just multiplying it by 4096. So we just need to left shift it by 12 bits. And then we load the newly crafted address A and get, therefore, data into the CPU cache with an address A that depends on the data D, which should not be accessible by the process at all. And what happens next? The process crashes because of an illegal memory access. However, there are many tricks to trick around. Some Intel CPUs have even features which you can use to prevent your program from crashing, but I'm not going into detail with it. The most easiest way that most people use is just we create a fork. So when the parent process dies, all the child process can continue to extract data. This is really a really intuitive way. So the next step is, this is the actual side channel. Now we probe if the address from the new process, we probe if the address A, which remember, the address of A depends on D, on the critical data D we want to extract, and see if it's in the cache or not. Why do we know this? Because when it's in the cache, it's loaded way more faster than it would be if it would be loaded from normal memory. And then we know this address is in the cache, so we know that D is in memory. That A is in memory. Which address depends on the data D. So the only thing we need to do is to revert that step. So from the address, we revert step 2 and make data again from the address. The whole trick is just that we, depending on the secret data, we just craft an address from it. That's the whole trick of all the CPU vulnerabilities and why we can exploit caching and caching behavior to extract data. So how can you, as average computer user or average programmer, protect yourself from CPU vulnerabilities? I mean, as always, apply security updates. Intel is working on it, AMD is working on it, I'm working on it. And again, don't trust the memory. This is really important. As long as data is in memory, we must expect that there is some way that malicious processes can extract that data. So don't trust the memory. How can you not trust the memory as a normal programmer? Overwrite critical data as soon as possible. This does not guarantee that that the data really vanishes from memory. There may still be some traces on the stack or on other copies of the heap because the operating system is copying some stuff around or whatever, but overwriting still makes it better. In C, there is a special function for this. It's not defined in the C standard, but Linux and all BSD systems implement it. It's the explicit B0 function, which overrides the data at the pointer just with zeros. And in the documentation, they say that at least for the GCC compiler and for the CLang compiler, it guarantees that the data will be overwritten in all the parts of the memory. However, there is in the mem page and in the documentation, there are some hints. It's not guaranteed for other compilers and not really well tested for any operating, for all operating systems, but at least on Linux and BSD, it should be safe. OpenBSD, by the way, uses this function a lot. So in Java, for passwords and critical data, just use character arrays. Why character arrays and not objects? Because character arrays is a primitive data type which is directly mapped to the bits and directly executed by the CPU. And actually, this is what Oracle recommends. All the password functions in the API return just character arrays, and the recommendation is override these character arrays or zero them out as soon as possible, as soon as you don't need it anymore. For other languages, such as Python and Go, which have immutable strings and rely on garbage collection, there is not really a way to guarantee that the data is really removed and overwritten from memory. So there's probably still some traces on the heap, still some traces on the stack, or wherever. There is no real guaranteed solution. So we need to work on that. So yeah, do you have some questions? We spoke about CPU vulnerabilities in general. We spoke about hyperthreading. We spoke about speculative execution and about how easy ways how you can prevent data loss. Are there any questions? I'm happy to answer them all. Yes? Yes, it is. This is actually what OpenBSD does. This is, for those of you who don't know OpenBSD, that's a Unix system with very strong focus on security, and they deactivate hyperthreading, and just take the performance impact. I mean, on a high production database server, you don't want anything that that reduces your performance. So other operating systems by now don't do it, but OpenBSD is strict enough and consequent enough to really do it. Yes? Yes. This is an approach. For example, Intel SGX enclave is a way to encrypt memory. So you have a host system and several virtual machines running on them, and all the data from even the kernel from the virtual machines are encrypted. Okay, so the host system and the other systems cannot even access them because the CPUs guarantee that all the data is encrypted. But still, you need to trust Intel. And the other important fact is some of these attacks that based on speculative executions are to break the encryption of SGX enclave, so to break the encryption of the memory. So there are side channels which break the encryption, well, or circumvent it at least. So encrypting the memory is not really the full solution to this. Does this answer your question? Depends on how the latest CPU, on which CPU you have, but the next Intel generation has some fixes for some Spectre attacks, but not all. Again, some attacks were discovered 2 days before, so the very next generation of Intel CPU is probably vulnerable for them. So, but I personally expect that in the next few years there will be more more CPUs with active side channel protection implemented. Yes?
Overwriting the memory, doesn't it just make the timing harder, but it doesn't fully circumvent the issue, right?
It doesn't fully solve the problem, no. But the key idea is when you remove the data from memory as soon as possible, it's there is nothing an attacker can extract. So you just make the time slot smaller. Yes?
Heading back to memory encryption, will be the actual moment of the memory being encrypted be the actual weak spot of this process? Because a malicious process would actually listen for exactly those processes that are occurring at this moment?
Perfectly right. That's the idea. And the intuition, yeah.
Okay.
Yes?
So if I'm correct, then mobile phones and systems with ARM chips are not really the problem right here with the Spectre and Meltdown. Am I correct?
No, unfortunately, not really. The vulnerabilities discovered 2 days before, they work on almost any architecture, including ARM, including RMD, and including even RISC-V. So even on exotic architecture, you're not really safe because it's in the design of the mechanism. There is something running which execution causes some side effects where you can and you can conclude back on the data. So you're not safe by using another CPU. The reason why there are so many or why many people think that it's just the Intel CPU is that Intel CPUs are the most popular, so researchers just focus on that.
Okay. Well then, thank you very much. For this